Hello and welcome to part 2 of my 3D printed 1/350 scale tiny Jupiter 2 build. Been quite a delay between the first part and the second part, and I did talk about that in my last video. Took a bit of a departure to work on some Halloween builds that extended on to Christmas. But we're back on to this build, and a lot of progress on the interior. I completed the outside of the ship and the lights in the lower core and the top bubble as I showed in my last video. So that's all ready to go. Working now on the interior and primarily working on the painting, several modifications that I made to the interior to give it a little more realistic look. But a fantastic kit. Comes with some really cool parts inside of it, but I wanted to make it just that much more realistic looking, because you're going to be able to see inside of it as far as I can tell from the little cockpit. Still not quite decided if I'm going to leave the top removable to some degree, because there are going to be lights wired into it. So we'll see how that all works. But let's go ahead and take a look at the progress that I've made on part 2. All right, so I'm starting work on the interior for the Jupiter 2. If you get this kit, one thing I highly recommend: clean it. I had originally done this in some mild soapy water and cleaned it out really good, let it dry. But I was trying to put some tape onto the back walls so that it wouldn't be covered. I wouldn't get paint on it. I was going to do some airbrushing using some Tamiya tape, which is really good tape, and it just would not stick at all, leading me to believe again that there's still some residue, something on this. So if the tape isn't going to stick, the paint's not going to stick. So I took some thinner, acrylic thinner from Tamiya, and I just took a brush and I just went all over the interior of this that I'm going to paint. Really got it in there good with a brush, wiped it around, took a Q-tip, and then dried it up. So hopefully it's done a good job. It feels good. It doesn't feel like any residue. But I'm really not going to be able to spray this with an airbrush. It's just too tiny. It's going to be hard to mask off the parts that I don't want paint to get on. So I'm just going to brush it on and hopefully get a nice finish without too many brush strokes. So I'm going to start with figuring out a mask for the floor, because you have that light tan circle in the middle and then the brown on the outside. So I figured if I paint the tan first and then I let it dry and then put a mask over it with a circle, then I can just paint the brown around it and hopefully get a decent finish. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you are going to see it, so I don't want it to look crappy either. So I'm kind of thinking of some paints that I can use. I don't have the exact colors, but I do have this NATO brown, which I might darken a little bit because it's a real dark brown. We'll see. And thinking about flat flesh or possibly some sand color from Automaster, Radone Tan actually, to use as the middle part. I'm trying to get some colors that look good together. All right. Also, I drilled a little hole out underneath for the elevator to stick an LED and SMD, and it broke off, which is fine. I can glue it back on. This thing is super tiny. Sorry. What I may try to do, but we'll see, it's so small, is maybe get some very thin styrene stripping and glue some vertical strips on it, maybe just like 3 of them, to get a little more detail, to look more like the elevator that's there. And then I can just paint that silver before I glue it in with some 5-minute epoxy. All right, let me go ahead and continue work on that. All right, so I'm working on some modifications on the interior. Nothing super major, but just to give it a little more correct detail. The first thing I did was I cut out the wall where you would have the hallway for the door. Mainly only because there's a window and you're going to see at least some of the light coming through there, some of the blue from the freeze tubes. And so I want that to be visible. Otherwise the wall would have been there and it wouldn't have shown through. So I just carved it out, took some styrene and just made a little shape and used 5-minute epoxy to glue it in there. And it's just sitting inside the ship right now. It's not glued in, but you can see that's going to open that up. You won't see a ton through that window, but you will see some light shining through. While I was at it, I went ahead and epoxied the little 3 lights on the disc in the top. Let that harden in. Once that's totally dry, I'll paint black over top of that so the light won't come through. And then the elevator that broke off, as I said, I took some real thin styrene stripping and I just glued it onto it in 3 places. So it gives it a little more of an appearance of the cage that's going to be there. And then I'll end up painting that silver and then I'll go right back there. All right. All right, so other than that, the only other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put some little thing. I sanded down the dome on the center console because I wanted to make it clear. And I'm going to use the same googly eye bubble that I used. No, actually, I might not. This one I might actually just use 5-minute epoxy. But I might just take some little bit of plastic and put it in there and paint it silver. And paint it dark underneath it. So we'll see. I'm thinking about lighting it from underneath, but I'm not quite sure yet. But I could do that because that's clear. Other than that, I'm not sure if I'll do any other detail. I'm kind of thinking about getting some images or taking some pictures of the walls, maybe from the larger Jupiter 2 that I have, the Mobius one, or even some pictures from the instructions. I'll have to see. And if I can shrink them down enough and just either make decals or just glue them onto there, because you're not going to really see much of it, but I do want to make it look a little more busy inside of there. Once I get that hashed out, then I can go ahead and start painting the floor and getting the interior completed on here. All right, so continuing working on some modifications or some of the pieces for my interior. One of the things I came up with, rather than trying to mask off a circle and trying to get it to be as close to perfect as I can for that center, because the floor has a light beige in the center or a light brown and then dark around the outer part. What I thought I could do is I could just paint the beige in the area of the center I want it to be. And then I cut off this piece of tubing, styrene tubing, which is a close enough diameter to the middle circle. And I'll just stick it inside, adhere it on somehow. Maybe not like really glue it, but just stick it in. And then hold it down and paint around it, at least to get a nice sharp edge of the brown, the dark brown. And then do the rest. That way it'll look close enough to being a nice even circle in the middle there. Without having to worry about trying to tape it and all that stuff and make it look right. And again, it's so small that you're going to see it from an angle coming in through this little front window. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to look very close. Some other things I did is I glued on some more thin styrene pieces to the elevator to give it a little more detail. And what'll be cool is it'll be painted chrome silver, and then the inside of it, which is that 3D printed part, will stay clear, and that'll light up from the hole coming up through the bottom. So that'll give it a glow inside and emphasize the detailing, which will be kind of cool. So that's pretty much ready to go. I'm going to leave that little stem on the top for now until I get it painted so I have something to hold on to. And then I can get that epoxied into there. In addition, I'm working on the freezing tubes. I want to put a little bit of a top piece on it. So I used some very thin styrene stripping. It's wide, but it's thin. And this this fiber optic is very resistant to glue for some reason. Do not know why. I'm sure the 5-minute epoxy would work well to hold anything onto it, but trying to use different types of plastic glues just is not working. And I don't want to mess it up with some AC. So what I've done is I just kind of bend it and curve it around it and hold it in place and pinch off kind of the edge of it, and then use some regular glue on the styrene stripping, which works fine on that. There we go. To glue that crimped edge on the back. So it fits over top of it. Once I get that 5-minute epoxy in place, then I can go ahead and snip off that part in the back, and it'll be behind it anyway, so you're not going to see it. I might do something similar with something on the bottom, like a little ring. We'll see. But it's very tricky because of the very tiny nature of these. I also went through and I drilled 3 more holes, a little in front of and in the center of the freezing tubes, because there's also some blue for thinner tubes that are coming up, and I have some thinner fiber optic, and this will fit through those holes, and that'll come up in between them. So there's one in between each of the 2 sets of 2 freezing tubes. And what I'm kind of thinking of doing, because I don't want to have a ton of LEDs on the bottom of this or the sides, it's really going to be hard to get the wiring to fit inside that little space. So the least number of SMDs that I can use, the better. I'm probably going to have still 3 blue ones in the back, but there's more room back here to accommodate those, so that's not such a big deal. But if I can work out something, at least for the freezing tube areas, where I can build some kind of a light box, or even 2 light boxes, very thin ones, or maybe even do my 5-minute epoxy thing. That might be an idea, where I coat an area, like 3 of them, with some 5-minute epoxy and glue the SMD into it, mask it off first so the plastic isn't glowing through just the holes, and then I could get away with less SMDs and just use some white ones, and then the blue one in the middle, I could just paint it blue with some clear blue. So we'll see. All right, so definitely making some progress here. It is rather tricky. In addition, I've also decided to, like I mentioned before, I'm going to go with some pictures that I was able to obtain from the instructions. Get a better picture here. There we go. It's like a picture of that. I just have to kind of mark out the things like the instructions there. But I can take that picture, I can put it into photo editing software and edit it down to the right size I want it to be. Once I get it to be the tiny size, I can print out several versions onto a decal and do the same thing with the other walls like this. And that's a pretty nice straight on shot of that. And again, when it's that small and it's a decal and I adhere it into the wall on the inside of this, it's going to look enough like the proper detail. I'm not going to worry about trying to light those up or anything, but they are going to look like there is some other controls on the walls. Thinking about doing the same thing with the back walls behind the freezing tubes, since there's some detail there. And when the blue shines through, that will look a little more realistic as well, because the freezing tube walls behind them have that detail right there. I thought about recreating it in some thin styrene stripping like I did for the elevator. Not sure, that might be a little much, but we'll see, we'll play with it. But having that on the wall behind it would be pretty cool. That would give it some detail for sure. The only other thing I have to worry about then or work out are these little silver mechanisms. Those are going to be super tiny. I could fashion something with a piece of styrene. Sorry for the shakiness. Like a thin styrene strip. I could just take a straight one and curve it up at the top, and then just put some beads of 5-minute epoxy on it to be those little domed surfaces, and paint the whole thing silver. That would at least give me a look of that detail behind it. So we'll see. But before I do any of that, I want to work on getting these printed out as some decals and figure out how that's going to work on the wall sections. And then we can kind of go from there. All right, and here's my first test shot of some decals. You can see how tiny they are. They look very grainy. So the resolution didn't come out really super sharp. That one kind of looks pretty cool. You can see the door, the little ladder steps going down this whole area. But definitely lost a lot of resolution when I shrunk it down. So I may have to work on that. But let me get and cut these out and put them into the interior and see how that looks, and we'll kind of get an idea of what we're working with. All right, so here's my first attempt with my first test of the decals. And they're in there kind of rough. I'm just sort of putting them in. I'm not putting any kind of decal setting solution or anything in there. And probably what I'm going to have to do is put a clear coat on the back of these walls so that they'll stick on a little better too. The resolution is pretty crappy for this size, but I like the concept, and I think it'll work out well once I get those images honed in. To see if I can get a little better resolution on those. But it definitely gives the interior a little more detail. And then when you have the 3D pieces in there, like the elevator in the back, the freezing tubes, that sort of thing, it's gonna come together to give it that image. Also not happy with those walls behind the freezing tubes. They look like they're tan or brown. I want them to be blue, because you're going to have some, some blue light glowing through there. Trying to get some light back there. Yeah, I'm not sure why they're brown. It's just a picture that I had of them. So I may have to get some better pictures as well and kind of go from there. Something higher resolution that holds the image on a sharper, a little bit sharper when you shrink it down. So, okay. All right, so I've got the finalized decals printed out, and I have them on some white backing and some clear backing in multiples of each. I have it honed down to the ones that I want to use that are going to look good. I tested them on the interior without it being painted, and they look pretty good. So the clear ones I'm going to need for the walls behind the freezing tubes right there, because I want the blue light to shine through, but I want to see some detail there. The rest of it's going to all be in the white backed, as far as the rest of the interior. And so I went ahead and I started painting the interior. It looks a little bit, it's dry, but it looks a little sloppy, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Initially started with a flat black and let that dry. And I did everything except those 3 panels you can see back there, nicely outlined, where the blue is going to shine through, because that's the only place where any light's going to shine through, other than the holes in the floor, the elevator, and the freezing tubes and that extra little tube coming through. Everything else is going to be just painted or decaled. Once that dried, I went over it with some chrome silver just to give it a little more light resistance. It's pretty good right now. I will be painting probably the bottom as well, so I won't have to worry about any light bleeds coming through. But that's dried now as well. So now I want to go ahead and look at getting some paint on it, starting with the floor and getting the two tones of brown on the floor. And what I'm going to use, and I'm not going to spray them because obviously it's a little hard in that tiny little piece. I'm going to have to decant some of this and then brush it on. But I have Testors Gloss Wood for the center, and I have Testors Gloss Brown for the outer circle. And these are the two actually I used on the big Mobius kit. So they look good. They look pretty close. I think they're even maybe the ones that they had recommended. So coming up with some ideas how to do that. I might be able to get some tape to stick on this now that it's painted. And so I'm thinking about still cutting out maybe a template to do that and try to get it as close as I can to being nice and crisp on there. So I'll start with the floor, and then I'll go ahead and paint the remainder. Pretty much mostly the walls I'm just going to paint white since they're going to have decals on them. And then those ribs sticking up are going to be, well, they're supposed to be dark tan, but the center of them is white. So we'll see what I'm going to do. I'm not quite sure. I might just do white on those as well. And then the center console will be like a tan color or a radome tan, that kind of a thing. And then the rest of it will be decals. So one other thing I did see that I had to do is I had to put on a gloss coat. I initially used some brush on Tamiya Clear, which is a gloss, on the insides because the decals just would not stick otherwise. This 3D, try to get a focus, this 3D printed material is pretty rough, as you can see. So the way this outside is, that's the way the inside was initially. Once I put some gloss on it though, I was getting them to adhere. Like those clear parts, they're just clear glossed right now. So I'm probably going to have to do the same thing again once this paint is fully painted, since I'm not using a gloss on the walls. What I might do, since the floor is glossy anyway, is once I get it all painted, I might just use a spray gloss and just throw it on there, or at least a satin gloss. That way I won't have to worry about messing up that translucent part where I want the light to shine through. So, okay. All right, well, let me see about getting some masks done, and then we'll go ahead and start painting that floor and then getting the interior painted. All right, so I have the inner circle painted with the gloss wood, and that's pretty much dried. It's not perfect, but it looks pretty good, especially when you're looking at it from this angle. You're only going to see that that glossy brown there. And then, so I removed the outer circle. I took the inner circle that I had carefully cut out, and I stuck it onto this piece of styrene sheet temporarily, and I punched a hole through with a hole punch. So it'll fit over top of that center piece, because I'm not going to be spraying it. I just need to line this up with that piece and adhere it down, and then paint brown all around it, the dark gloss brown. And I put a little arrow on the one corner, because one corner has a tiny little bit of a niche, which is I put in the back, so it's easy enough to line it up. So it's going to be right where it needs to be. So I just have to line it up with this light brown, stick it down, and then paint the dark brown around the edges. So I also painted some JA green on the control panel, because that's the base color of it. Once I put the decal, that'll bring out some more lighter colors on it. And I used some metallic gray for those raised little control panels, because that's what they're supposed to be. Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but I painted Radone tan onto the center circle dome console thing. And then I'm working on the bubble and that kind of thing. I'm just going to go back to the googly eye, which I did for the top dome, and just work on a nice good version of that to stick on it, and put some kind of tiny little detail under it to look like machinery. And then one other thing I did is, because I had, sorry, get in there, because I had cut out this section, they had these ribbed parts just evenly put around the interior. So one of them got cut out when I cut that part out, and they're not exactly separated that way in the real ship, because there's different types of terrain or different widths of the different panels and such. But what I did was I took, I'm sorry, I can't get it to focus right there, but you can see this one here in the middle, the clear one. I took that piece, let me see if I can bring that closer. There we go. Okay. So I cut that piece out of the section that I had cut out of here and sanded the back off of it. I also carved out the one that was right there because it wasn't in the right place. Smooth that out. And then I glued it over just a little bit to the right, so that those two sections, this one and this one, are the same size, the same width. So what I'm going to do is then have the two pieces. This isn't one of the ones I'm using, but sort of like this. This should be the one on the right. Has a door and a ladder and some fire and some fire extinguishers or something there. And then the one on the left is going to have like all the other colorful detail, like the red ball and all the squares that are orange and yellow and that kind of thing. So, all right. So I don't really have to mask that off. I can just paint that whatever color I'm going to paint the other ribs, which I think I'm going to do probably the Radone tan as well. And I have Model Masters for that. Is it Radome or Radone? I think it's Radome tan. But it's kind of a light tan, which is sort of like what the inner walls are. There are two different basic shades. One's lighter and one's a darker tan. I think it's like an armor tan, sand or something like that. I can't remember. But there's not a whole lot of detail. Those ribs are not that big. I'm not going to get multiple tones on them. And likewise, the sides on either side of the cockpit are going to be painted with that tan as well, and maybe a little bit of dark highlight in the middle kind of thing. So, all right. But other than that, coming along well. I'm just going to do like a white on the back walls of these ones and the one for the elevator. Or I may just do a tan back there. We'll see. I'm not sure what color. I think it's supposed to be a darker color behind the elevator, but you're not going to see it. You're not going to see behind the elevator. But I'll probably just do like a light tan back there. So, okay. All right. Sorry about that. So, coming along well. Painting is just about done. Then I can start putting the decals on. All right, so one other quick adjustment I had to make is on the front of the control panel. For some reason, there was a major gap there between that and the in the outer shell of the ship, and it was very visible. So I just took some of this flat rectangular styrene, and I started with one piece. Sorry for the focus there. And I cut it so that it would fit along that edge and glued it in place with some AC glue. And then checked it again. It was still a little too short, so I put another piece on. That seems to be just perfect. So from the previous stills, you could see that fills in that gap, and it looks good. Not quite sure what color I'm going to paint that. I'm going to have to look at the bigger ship and just kind of see. I'm going to guess probably the olive green, or the JN green, or the JA green I have on there. So we'll see. Possibly some other color, like some gray or something, but I don't think it's silver, because it makes like the shelf for the windshield go back way too far, and I don't want it to look like that. So okay, all right, so I have that inner circle on there, masking off the gloss tan or wood that I have on there, and I also got some white on it, initial coat of white around the areas where I need it. Sorry. And I think I'm going to go over that with some of the Radome tan as well, around all of those. And the decals will cover everything except right behind the elevator, and of course the ribs. Those I may just leave white, because they pretty much have a white accent on them. So, okay. All right, so I finished all the painting. I got the brown in there. And I got the Radome tan around the edges of it, and on the side pieces. I've started putting the decals on. So I have those two over there in the back. I have some extra ones, so if I don't like how they fit, I might trim them down a little bit more and put them in there. But they definitely give it more detail, and you're really not going to see them that clearly, because the light's going to be dimmer inside of there, but it kind of gives you the idea. So I have to put one more back there for the door, and then I have to put the ones on the clear parts for the tubes, and then we'll see how that looks. Hello, so obviously those previous stills were not the finished painted interior, but a horrible mishap that I foolishly allowed to happen. I have since fixed it, so I'm glad about that, but I had taken out a bottle of Tamiya silver to chrome silver in order to do some tiny highlighting, and foolishly spilled it all over my cutting board, and a big pool of it right in the middle of the finished painted decaled interior, which lots of choice words were said, mainly to myself for being an idiot and allowing it to happen. So I immediately took some Tamiya thinners and doused it in there and rinsed it around, fearing the worst, that it was going to mess up my decals and I'd have to strip the whole thing down and do it again. Fortunately, the decals were pretty hardy, and they were not affected at all and didn't really get any of the silver paint on them. The cockpit a little bit in the front, but again, it rinsed off really well from the thinner since the paint was fresh. The only thing that was kind of messed up still was the floor, as you saw in those previous stills. So I was able to strip that back down, which I'll show some pictures here shortly. And then this time I went ahead and masked off the walls and the seats and the control panel and the cockpit in the front, because it was able to stick to it now with the dry decals, and then just airbrush onto the floor to get a better finish. So it turned out better than it was originally, and disaster averted. The decals, I used Walther's Solvaset, which really did a good job of sealing those decals in, so they were well protected, and there wasn't really any problem with those. For the floor, instead of trying to mask it off and make the different sections, what I did was I cut out a circle in really thin paper-like styrene, and had it nice and smooth, and then I painted it I spray painted it with the light wood, and then I airbrushed the brown floor in the middle, and then put a gloss coat over it, and then I put the plastic piece inside of it while it was still wet, and then gloss coated over the whole thing. So it turned out really well. So let me go ahead and show you those stills, and then I'll show you the finished product, and got it back to where it was supposed to be. All right. All right, so as you can see, I got it finished, and I got it back to where it was supposed to be. And I do have a glossy finish on the bottom, which I want to have, because I want that to shine a little bit, whereas the rest of it will not shine. And I think that'll show up a little bit better once the lights are in it and you can see it. But as I said, I cut out a disc of really thin sheet styrene. I've used it before in other builds. It's just paper thin, but it is styrene, and you can cut it out just like paper with scissors. And it can be painted, of course, so I just taped it down on a piece of tape, and I sprayed over it. For this particular one, I used the gloss wood enamel from Testors that I showed earlier in the video. I could not get the dark brown to work. It still has lots in it, but it must be clogged, and I tried to fool with it, but I couldn't get any to come out. So I gave up on that, and I just used some NATO brown, which I thought would be a little too light from the cap. The cap's always hard to tell what color it is, but I think it turned out just fine. It's nice and dark, so that looks good. So I had taped it off as I showed in the previous stills, all the walls, and those decals held up really well. No issue at all with the silver paint on them. Same with the clear parts. Those dark spots there are some silver paint that I put on, which I have to touch up a bit on that one to imitate those big metal globe things with tubes that you'll see through. Same with over there a little bit. But no issues there. I have the control panel done, and I add a little bit of green and orange paint on it to give it some color. The only part that I brushed on is right there underneath the seats, which you're not going to see through the front, because it would have been really hard to mask off those chairs and airbrush it. So I just brushed it on by hand. But no big deal. And I went ahead and put a black coat of or a coat of black primer on before it, or not primer, but some flat black, so it would be light resistant, so the light wouldn't come through. So it turned out better than it was originally. Thankfully, I said do a little bit of touching up. I do have the elevator glued in there in the back. I'm going to be working on the tubes for a future video, because I kind of changed course on that. Having a lot of trouble getting this thick fiber optic to take anything glued to it, even with 5-minute epoxy, probably because it's pretty much rubber. So exhausted some other options back and forth, so I went ahead and ordered some 1/16 clear rod from Plastruct, because I couldn't find any locally, and it should be coming here in the next few days. That should be fine and do the job, so we'll work on those in the future. I also took out the main little round console in the middle. I just drilled through with a Dremel a little bit until it just broke free on its own, so I can glue that back in. That way I could work on it without that being in the way. So, all right, so let me go ahead and just show you real quick, like a light test. I'll put some lights in for the elevator and the blue wall, and just kind of show you what that's going to look like. All right, and here's a test lighting, and the light's going to look a bit washed out from the camera. Oops, sorry, just holding it on a battery. But the blue looks really blue in real life. It doesn't look like it does in the video. And then the elevator, you can see, is lit up and it's glowing white. And again, this is going to be enclosed within the ship. So all three of those back walls are going to be lit up blue. I just have the one right now with an SMD behind it. And that'll be finalized. The only other thing, well, the tubes are going to be lit up in front of that, so they're going to be clear as well. And then I'm thinking about possibly putting something on the top, shining down like a white light just to illuminate it somewhat. So we'll see. But that's going to look pretty cool. I just have to get all the lights nicely compacted in here, so I'm not wasting too many SMDs on this tiny little interior. So, all right, but it's looking pretty cool. Get that off there, and I still have to put the center part back in again, and then obviously work on the freezing tubes. So. The freezing tubes, I've decided to take a different route. So right now I'm just waiting on some 1/16 clear rod, acrylic rod from Plastruct, which I cannot get locally. And it'll be more of the right diameter, plus it should work fine for gluing on some the stripping at the bottom and the top, since I was having such a hard time with the kind of rubberized fiber optic that I was using for it, which really wasn't working out too well. So, okay. But looking much better, and I'm glad I could save the mess up that I made by spilling silver paint all over it. And I still need to get a new cutting board. This one's looking pretty beat. It's about time for a new one anyway, so, okay. All right, so that's gonna go ahead and wrap up this video for part 2. Sorry for the length of it. It's really exacting work trying to detail and paint and come up with the schemes for this tiny little scale interior. So it's pretty much all finished at this point, as you saw. I just have to work on the freezing tubes, which I'll be doing in the next video, and then get the lighting wired into it. So that's what I'll be focusing on the third part of this, and then completing up my tiny little Jupiter 2. So thank you to my new subscribers. Really quickly heading towards 1,000 here. Last I checked, it was 990. So by the next video, I should probably be hitting 1,000. So I'm really grateful to everyone who is supporting my channel and subscribing and checking out my videos. So stay tuned. A lot of really cool stuff coming up this year. And coming up on this build is in the future as well. All right, thanks a lot.